Welcome to South Coast Matters. I'm Paul Latendra.
And I'm Julie Taylor. And South Coast Matters is a public access show where we bring together civic leaders, business leaders, and citizens to discuss how we can work in harmony to have a positive impact on our South Coast communities.
Today's guest, Steve Smith. Steve was with us a few weeks ago, and we spoke about his job as Southeastern Regional
Planning
and Economic Development District. Did I get it right?
You got it right, Paul. Very good.
It took me 3 months to learn that.
But it's no longer my job. I'm retired from it. But it's great to be back.
Only 33 years. Same job for 33 years. Nobody does that. No one.
It was never the same 2 days in a row, and that's
Good.
probably why I lasted so long.
How long did you work there before you became executive director?
I came there after college, and I did a stint in the National Guard, and I took a job there as an entry-level planner in 1969, expecting to stay a short stint. And I always liked the job, loved the job, and one thing turned into another, and before I know it, I'm retiring after 46 years of service in the same place.
God bless. God bless.
So what was the biggest challenge when you first started working at SERPED, and how has that challenge kind of solved itself over time?
Well, from an internal standpoint, budgets and personnel were always a challenge, but in terms of the region, the biggest challenge, which hasn't solved itself over time, was the economic inequities in this region, certainly compared to the rest of the state. We have not, Fall River and New Bedford in particular were always economically distressed communities with higher unemployment rates, lower median income, lower educational attainment. And that's improved. I think we've closed the gap somewhat, but we haven't closed it enough. And so that was the challenge then. In fact, my very first week on the job, I was working on this economic strategy for the region. I have this old big mimeographed report that we worked on. And it's a little scary at how things haven't changed as much as they should in that regard. They've gotten better, no question, but it's still a tough road to hoe.
So at the end of our last show, Paul wanted you to kind of think about a vision. So
we talked about, at the end of the last show, we talked about you've started in 1968 with the
69.
69.
Yeah.
Come up to here. We know the changes. Most of us know the changes that have happened in the area over the last 40 years, and most of us are pretty proud of them. But some things have gone well, other things not so well. How do you envision? What do you see for the next 20 years, the next 40 years, and both with and without the South Coast Rail? Because in my mind right now, the South Coast Rail is probably as a guaranteed as one of the casinos in the area. We, everybody agrees that there's going to be one, but who knows? Yeah.
Well, when I became director in 1983, I'd like to think that things I hoped had happened then would happen then have occurred by now, and they all haven't happened even to today. I mean, the Middleborough Rotary remains our biggest traffic nightmare. It's just gotten worse, and we don't seem to be able to solve that problem. We don't have South Coast Rail. We did build replace the Brightman Street Bridge in Fall River, between Fall River and Somerset, and we replaced the Berkeley-Dighton Bridge. So
They're
those
beautiful bridges.
and I went back and looked at things that I was involved in 1983 when I first became director, and those were all issues that were on the table. Let's replace the Brightman Street Bridge. Let's replace the Berkeley-Dighton. So things take a whole lot longer. They seem to eventually get done. It would be nice if the Middleborough Rotary got done. There's the New Bedford Fairhaven Bridge, which is a bottleneck down there, particularly for development of the harbor.
How do you fix the Middleborough Rotary? I drive through there quite often.
You blow it up.
Yeah.
Not literally. I mean, you keep the road. You need to put a flyover to divert some of the traffic and just blow it right by there. So some of the through traffic on Route 44, particularly, there are some pretty good plans in place, and they're not really that expensive. I mean, relative to South Coast Rail, I mean, we're talking maybe $50 million versus $2 billion or something like that. So there are plans that it was held up for a while because Middleborough, they were the first suitors for the Wampanoag Casino. They were going to pay for all that, and the state said, okay, you can pay for it, we're not going to bother. And so I think the town got set back, and then the Wampanoags decided to go to Fall River for a while before they ended up in Taunton. But there are things like that that, you know, I envisioned 32 years ago would happen and didn't. So I'm a little scared to predict the future, and particularly with the anniversary of the Back to the Future and all the things they say they got wrong when that movie came out. They predicted in 2015 we'd all be having everyone have fax machines, but they didn't have smartphones. So.
Yeah.
But hopefully we can get South Coast Rail built, and hopefully that will have a significant impact on the region in terms of its development patterns, because one of the things probably the main thing that would happen with South Coast Rail is that it would focus investment in the cities or where there are train stations, Fall River, New Bedford, Taunton primarily. There are some stations in other locations. And there would be what we planners like to call transit-oriented development, but high-density housing, mixed-use development around train stations where people can live. They don't need to own a car. They can hop on the train and commute to a job in Boston or north of us. And there would be investment. I think the CARTA plan envisions as many as up to 8,000 housing units built around train stations in related to South Coast Rail. Even Freetown passed zoning around the proposed train station site.
Are you talking mixed zoning for
Yeah.
business and?
So new investment in those cities, attracting new people into those cities, attracting some middle class, younger people back into those cities, I think would have an enormous impact. It also should relieve some of the development pressure on some of the smaller towns surrounding those cities. So in an ideal world, you have more investment in these cities and improvement, and we already are seeing millennials and younger people wanting to go back and live in these cities. And we're seeing probably less development pressure in the surrounding towns, which more open space preservation, less pressure on school systems and so forth. So, so the vision I see and Southeastern Regional Planning is all about the future, looking to the future. So the future I would see is a more vibrant and healthier cities, Fall River, New Bedford, Taunton, Attleboro. The town's not growing as rapidly because in some cases they grew much faster than they were capable to handle. The schools couldn't handle the enrollment. They were losing open space with fairly large lot zones. So those are two things I think could happen. So there would be environmental benefits, there would be economic benefits and so forth. We'll see if that comes to pass.
You mentioned that Freetown passed zoning for transit-oriented development, but then I understand that Taunton did not at the former train station over off 44. It was a real estate office for a bit, but they wanted to put some in there. Now, why do you think that didn't pass? Is it people weren't familiar?
I thought they had. I'm not sure about that.
Okay.
This is at Arlington Street. I thought they had. I know there was a developer who wanted to come in there and build some high-density housing in advance of the train station. And I think what he wanted was probably more dense than zoning allowed. And there was concern about traffic just from his development because it's a pretty bad intersection. So I'm not sure what the status of that is. But Freetown town meeting went from, they took a 77-acre parcel down on South Main Street and allowed a density of 6 units per acre, whereas the density in the rest of the town is basically 1 unit per 70,000 square foot lot. So they increased the density by, almost 8-fold in this area. And that was pretty radical for Freetown to do it, but they said, well, this train, it could mean something and it would be a good thing for our town. It was a contentious town meeting. It was a difficult
I'm sure
vote.
it was.
But they did pass it. They did pass it unanimously after, pretty heartfelt discussion.
So what kind of information was given to residents? Because I know in the town that Paul and I live in, it would probably be pretty difficult to do something like that.
Well, I had to do a pitch at town meeting, and I'm a Freetown resident, and I was pretty worried because this was a fairly radical concept that I'm going to come in and you have a town that basically large lots, single-family homes, and you're saying, we want to create one part of town that has much denser housing with with commercial development mixed in. And so I did this presentation to town meeting, which I didn't think went really well. And the first questions got up and they were fairly contentious, like, who is this guy? You know, I'd only lived there 27 years, so I was obviously an outsider and somebody who was a newcomer. And there were concerns. And then some of the local people got up and said, you know, we're getting old and we have parents, and this might not be such a bad thing. You know, we don't have to get in our cars to drive to Dunkin' Donuts to get our coffee in the morning. We walk downstairs and get the coffee. And some of the locals, you know, they got beyond their initial dislike, and I remember one person speaking in particular hated this idea 6 months earlier. He just thought it was terrible, but we talked about it, and he went and visited other comparable developments in Mashpee and in Marshfield and other parts, and he said, yeah, this isn't so bad, maybe this could work. So it took an education process, and it took winning over. I'm a planner. I try to convince people of my ideas, but they're very different for some people, and so I had no illusions about my being able. Certainly college degrees don't work. Then they don't give you any additional credibility. You need to convince the locals to do the selling, and that was taking them and showing them how it worked and how it looked, and it wasn't such a horrible thing.
Now, I envision this Mashpee Commons, you mentioned Mashpee, type village around train stations, which I lived in Canada for a while, and you did have that type of thing around a train station. You had parking, you had very accessible sidewalk, you had businesses, you had desirable residences above the businesses, which we're used to. We have that set thing in cities like Fall River and New Bedford, that if you live above a business, you're there because nobody else will take you. There's no place else to get. So,
but it's you know, in other parts of the country, particularly in Europe and other parts of the world, it's very common. And one of the things we've found is that younger people in particular, they want choice in housing, and if you're a small rural or suburban community and you're only building the same kind of housing, a single family home with 3 or 4 bedrooms on a 50, 60, 70,000 square foot lot, people don't want that. You got to give them, if you want to attract some younger people and have a more vibrant community, you got to offer some choices, and we found that a lot of our zoning was not doing that. It was creating very much a homogeneous kind of community. And the issue of choice was one that I think is driving people to sort of back to the cities and to rehabilitate older properties and so forth.
how do you, I have feelings about this too, so I'll ask you, what do you think the role of the automobile will be 50 years from now?
Well, that's a good question. I think it will be a lot different, and I think it'll be a lot less. First of all, we could have self-driving cars, and if we have self-driving cars, and I'm more and more convinced seeing these Google demonstrations and so forth, that that's very feasible. They don't need as much space, and they can more efficiently use the road, and they, you don't have to worry. I know people are afraid of the cars driving themselves, but I'm afraid of driving with other people on the road texting while they're driving, so there's a trade-off here. The other thing is, I heard this woman who founded Zipcar, I believe is the company, Robin Chase, speak at a transportation forum, and she talked about all this excess capacity that we have in transportation, that we have cars that basically are on the road maybe an hour a day, 2 hours at most if you're commuting to a job, and then they sit idle. And the Zipcar notion was you could go have all this excess capacity and you could use it. So, and then the things like Uber, and they seem to be trending toward car ownership is less significant, that we'll probably have less cars per capita. I mean, if it used to be that at 1 car per family, and now a lot of houses are built with 3-car garages. And I think that has peaked, and I think that's changing. So So I think we might see fewer cars per person. We might see a more efficient utilization of the road network with technology changes, but I'm scared to go there because probably 30 years we thought we'd be flying around in personal helicopters. But I think that things will change.
Inevitably, the price of oil will go up again because it's a natural resource and it's not an infinite resource, and that will definitely change the...
But then we could be Back to the Future, and they could be powering cars with garbage like Marty McFly
that's
did.
true.
You know,
Yeah.
So,
as long as you get clean emissions from it.
I think 10, 15 years ago, I remember going to conferences here in the region and listening to speakers talk about peak oil, and they were saying by now we would have, oil would be so expensive because it would be so little accessible, and it just hasn't. I mean, the energy picture, it just has changed so radically. Not all the better necessarily, but, and we're facing enormous challenges that just in Somerset and Plymouth with big power plants going down, and trying to replace those with renewable energy is going to be a real challenge for the region.
Now, what's going to happen in Somerset with those beautiful towers they built?
Yeah, they
Those
remind me
cooling
of
towers.
who's
I
that
wrote an article
cartoon
on
guy?
those for
Yeah, I
South Coast Inside.
I know. I remember reading that, and I don't know what it. They
Yeah,
got
I can't imagine
to turn
what
them
you
into
could do
condos
with them.
and
Yeah,
paint them. I think Liliana wants to paint them bright colors.
bungee jumping from them.
So since we're on the energy thing, we kind of jumped over to energy now. What do you think about the pipeline, or why should people down here care about what's going on with this whole pipeline thing?
It's just the pipeline across northern Massachusetts and so forth.
To bring in more natural gas capacity.
I don't know enough about it to really comment in intelligent fashion. I suppose that hasn't stopped me in the past, but
Hasn't stopped anybody else.
Is it a big factor in the South Coast?
I don't think so. I mean,
Yeah.
I do think that obviously the conversion to natural gas, for example, there's legislation filed by, supported by a whole bunch of South Coast legislators, led by Representative Haddad, that would basically permit gas-fired facilities on like the old Brayton Point and Montauk properties without, I think, going through all the permitting. So I think natural gas is a sort of a bigger part of the equation going forward, at least as a bridge fuel before we can be completely renewable. But I don't know enough about our capacity to distribute that within the region and the pipelines and so forth, and whether that really makes a difference for us. I don't want LNG tankers coming into Fall River.
No, we had that battle before, that's true.
So if that's the alternative, I'll take that over the LNG tankers.
But the LNG isn't going to be a factor anymore since Taunton River's
Sure.
become wild and scenic, though, correct? Wasn't that part of the reason?
Yeah. I mean, they could still come in and unload short of the wild and scenic part of the river. I mean, they could Tiverton or South Fall River if
Well,
they
let's
really
hope
wanted
not.
to pursue it. I don't think it's economically viable. I don't think we're going to see that come back, but
Well,
who
let's hope
knows?
not. That could be rather disastrous.
Yeah, in more ways than one.
Yeah.
Sure.
So, are you optimistic or pessimistic?
I'm always optimistic.
Good.
I don't know whether the optimism is always tinged with enough realism, but this is a wonderful region. First of all, it has just great natural resources. The coastline, it's just the landscape is beautiful. So we have a terrific region, a very desirable place to live, and our economy has always been sort of in the toilet, or at least not as good as it should be. Let's put it that way.
I think we have such high expectations too.
We do, but we do need to do better. I do think, and I'm encouraged that a lot of policymakers, whether they're city officials or legislators, are focusing on education as the really key factor to turn the region around. The days of the textile mills and the apparel factories in Fall River, they're gone, and those jobs are gone, and we need to have a much different profile to our labor force to be successful.
What do you think of Amazon coming into Fall River?
Well, I'm terrible Amazon customer. I mean, I buy so much stuff from Amazon, it's embarrassing because I hate to go out shopping out of the malls and so forth. So as a matter of fact, I bought the car I own by, I had some Amazon stock that I sold that increased in value by about 16-fold from whenever.
Oh, well, that worked out well.
So I thought it was a good thing. Now people would say, well, they're just warehouse jobs, they're not the best jobs, but they're better than no jobs. It should not have a real bad imprint in terms of environmentally, you know. I don't know if they're going to be sending out thousands of drones out of that, they call it fulfillment center.
Well, they're supposed to be regulating drones now, isn't that the newest
Yeah,
thing?
I
Some
guess.
sort of. But isn't there some revival of manufacturing, even if it's small manufacturers? I mean, this has been historically an area of manufacturing.
There
and
is.
people are skilled that way down here, and it seems like that would be a great thing to try to revive.
You know, it's a good thing, and in my time in this career field, in this field, there was a point in time where manufacturing was not seen as desirable. You know, it was seen as dirty jobs, and if you looked at the statistics, Southeastern Mass had a much higher percentage of manufacturing jobs in the state as a whole, and Boston area had Wang and Digital and the big sexy
Right.
computer companies back in the 80s, and we were stuck with these big manufacturing companies, and this was seen as such a bad thing. And now I think we realize those are pretty good jobs. I mean,
Very good
particularly
jobs.
if they're cleaned up and not environmentally damaging. So, and it is coming back, you're right. I think people are realizing that it doesn't make sense to manufacture everything overseas, and that there's certainly value to the skilled labor we have and so forth. So I think that's encouraging. And, you know, and I'm particularly encouraged by the biotech sector, which seems to have a real foothold in Southeastern Mass, and is certainly a growth sector going forward. And it's not traditional manufacturing for sure, but at some point they have to, you know, they may be able to go into the labs and work on these things in Cambridge and in Boston area, but at some point they got to scale up and go into production and do this.
They are pretty labor intensive too,
Yeah.
as far as oversight of watching
So-
cultures grow, but having human beings around to just oversee the cultures, from what I
Right.
understand.
Right.
Well, there was some move to bring some of that to the Worcester area as well, to kind
Yep.
of revive the Worcester area, and there
Right.
seems like there's got to be enough work to be able to spread it out over 2 regions.
We do have a lot of it's in medical devices, but between Johnson & Johnson, I don't think they're called that anymore,
right.
in Rainham
Yep.
and Covidian up in Mansfield and
Yep.
some of the bigger companies. And then New Bedford and Fall River both have smaller medical device companies, Taunton. So it is a sector that's growing. And, you know, you could hit it right. Some company could come up with some miracle cure for something and go really big time and make an enormous difference.
So how much, do you know how much the South Coast contributes to the GDP of the state's GDP? Is it?
You know, I think in the Serpent region, we represented about, from a population standpoint, about 8-9% of the state as a whole, population-wise. I think if you looked at and then they look at different sectors in the economy, in terms of whether we had more or less than that being a benchmark. So we'd have a higher retail, we'd have a higher manufacturing than the state. Generally, I think, Metro Boston, though, is off the charts in
Yeah,
terms
sure.
of performance.
Yeah.
So Southeast Massachusetts tends to be below. If you look at journey to work numbers, which are traffic counts where people are going, we have about twice as many people leaving the region to find jobs elsewhere as coming into the region to find jobs here. It's a fairly significant number. I mean, there are obviously a lot of people who work locally, but there are a whole lot more people leaving the region. Now, I'm sure they don't like those commutes. And I'm sure some of them are people who are well-educated, going to better paying jobs they can get in 128 in Metro Boston.
Right.
If they had opportunities here, because they like living here, obviously, they're driving out, but they're coming back every day. If we can get them job opportunities in this region, they represent a lot of the skilled workforce that we already have. They must be tired of commuting north.
Yeah, it gets
And,
worse every day.
Yep.
I remember I went to UMass Boston. I lived in Fall River, and I commuted for half a semester. I commuted, but I could leave at 7 o'clock and hit an 8:30 class. There's no way you could do that. You know? Now, when I was working my last job out of Taunton, I'd have to drive up to Boston, Revere or something. To get someplace at 7:30, I'd have to leave 5. Because if you leave at 5 and leave at 6, you get there at the same time. So if you leave at 5, you'd get there early. If you leave at 6, you'd be too late. It's too late. So.
Well, South Coast Rail from Fall River to UMass Boston, you know, I don't know the schedule, the projected schedule, I think that would be a little over an hour. But more importantly, it's reliable. I mean, you know, other than a major snowstorm or something, you know pretty much when you get on the train what time you're going to get off.
I'm so old. This was before UMass Boston was at the new campus.
Oh.
This was downtown UMass Boston.
I remember that. Yeah. Well, the rail will give you the predictability, and that's huge. And you never know when you leave your house going up Route 24 what you're going to hit, you know, what accident there's been, or you know,
only takes
where
one.
the congestion will be.
One little, even somebody to be broken down, doesn't have to be an accident, enough to screw it up. So it seems like going forward that the economic thing is one of our biggest challenges, and the South Coast Rail could be a pretty big part to
We're running out
to
of
that.
time.
Yes,
but
that's why I
wanna
wanted
give
to wrap
Steve-
it up.
Yeah. What do you want to leave us with, Steve? After 33 years of economic director of this whole
In 30
planning.
seconds, 30 seconds, about all
No,
we
he
have.
has about
Well, I can
60
do it.
seconds.
You know, I think as we were talking about before we went on the air, that it's not rocket science, that it's a lot of hard work, investing in the right priorities, getting the state's attention to invest in us and making our case. But education is a key. I do think we have to, you know, make sure we have good schools and good job opportunities, and other things will follow. This is a great region. We need people, particularly policymakers in Boston, to understand that and learn that, and we need private investors to come down and see it. But I'm very bullish on the future of Southeastern Mass and the South Coast.
Good.
So,
Stephen Smith, thank you so much for being here.
thank you.
2 whole shows. We appreciate it. We'll get you back again, I hope. too.
Great.
That would
No,
be
I'd love to
great.
do it again.
Good.
Okay.
Thank you for being with us at South Coast Matters. I'm Paul Attendra.
And I'm Julie Taylor, and make sure you check out our Facebook page, South Coast Matters, and also send us feedback, comments, questions to southcoastmatters@gmail.com.
Good night.
Good night.